I had spent years wandering the dense forests and sprawling cave systems of northern Appalachia, studying the intricate webs of life that made this secluded corner of the world their home. My name is Dr. Ethan Carter. I am an ecologist by trade, but a lifelong lover of the unknown by passion. It was my career, my calling, to understand the delicate balance of ecosystems, to decode the silent conversations between predator and prey, flora and fauna, everything that lived in balance together. I thought I had seen it all, until the summer of 1985, when my research took a dark, unforeseen turn. It began innocuously enough, as these things often do. My team and I were conducting a routine survey of the local black bear population, a crucial apex predator in these parts. However, our data showed an alarming trend, a sharp decline in bear sightings, bordering on local extirpation. Poaching, habitat destruction, and climate change were the usual suspects, as they were for their cousins, the grizzly bears that once also inhabited the area. And our initial investigations suggest a combination of these factors was indeed responsible for the bear's disappearance. As we delved deeper into our research, a new and disturbing phenomenon emerged. Reports from the nearby town of Ashwood detailed strange sightings of other creatures. Gaunt, twisted forms with pallid skin and sunken eyes. These beings have been sighted across the country, not just in Appalachia, and the online communities have termed them crawlers. At first these accounts were dismissed as hysteria, tales spun from campfire stories and late-night paranoia. But the reports grew more frequent and consistent, and the fear in local people's voices was palpable. My initial skepticism dissolved when I encountered the first of these crawlers myself. It was during a late-night expedition into the Whispering Caverns, a sprawling underground network that had long fascinated spelunkers and biologists alike. The air was thick with moisture, and the silence was broken only by the distant drip of water and the occasional scurrying of small cave dwellers. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing ancient stalactites and shimmering mineral deposits. Then I saw it. A fleeting glimpse at first, a flash of movement at the edge of my vision. I dismissed it as a trick of the light, the product of fatigue and overactive imagination. But when the beam settled on a figure, hunched and shivering, my blood ran cold. The creature's eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the light back at me with a feral intensity. Its limbs were unnaturally long, and its skin was deathly pale, almost translucent. It stared at me for a moment that felt like an eternity, before skittering off into the deeper darkness, away from me and my light. That day I returned to my camp, my mind racing and my body shaken. These crawlers were real, and their emergence seemed to coincide eerily with the bear's disappearance. The next few weeks were a blur of frantic research and investigations, interviews with locals. Patterns began to emerge, but not the ones we expected. It seems that over the last few decades, as the bears and other predators in the region had been persecuted mercilessly, their absence had created an ecological niche that these crawlers were now exploiting. It became clear that the bears had been an inadvertent check on the crawler population, their presence in the forests keeping these creatures confined to the deeper, less accessible parts of the cave systems. This was made evident after my team and I discovered a fascinating find. My team and I embarked on an expedition into the Whispering Caverns, a popular tourist destination now cordoned off due to its danger. We entered a section so rarely explored that even the most seasoned spelunkers in our group paused with trepidation. The air was thick there, saturated with a metallic tang that clung to the back of my throat. Our flashlight struggled to penetrate the inky darkness, revealing only fragments of the cavern's ancient secrets. After hours of cautious navigation through narrow passageways and jagged rock formations, we stumbled upon a chamber that seemed different from the rest. It was vast and cathedral-like, with stalactites hanging from the ceiling like the fangs of some beast itself. In the center of the chamber, partially buried under mounds of rock, lay a massive skeleton. Or should I say, multiple skeletons. The one in the center could be no other creature than that of a grizzly bear. The sight was both awe-inspiring and grotesque. The bear's bones were enormous, a testament to its once formidable size, yet it was the other bones that truly caught my attention. Scattered around this skeleton were the fragmented, gnawed remains of numerous humanoid beings. Their twisted limbs and shattered skulls told a story of a brutal, desperate battle.
"Look at this!"
My assistant Sarah, an understudy from university who was assisting me during this, whispered, voice barely audible. She pointed to the bear's jaw, still locked in a grimace of eternal rage. Wedged between its teeth were the remnants of a crawler's arm, its brittle bones gnawed and splintered. I bit my lip as we stared at the confusing scene. This bear, it must have gotten trapped down here. Maybe it wandered in after the crawlers following their scent, or perhaps it fell through a hidden shaft. She nodded, as my mind raced to piece together the scene before us.
"It must have starved to death,"
Sarah suggested, as she pointed to the splintered bones that indeed had been cracked open, as if the great beast was extracting every last bit of nutrients it could from its prey, before ultimately succumbing to the lack of food in this space. The realization hit us all like a tidal wave. This bear, a solitary guardian from a bygone era, had encountered the crawlers centuries ago, likely following their scent one autumn or winter, then eventually succumbing to the cave's oppressive confines. It made sense, as during winter, bears hibernate in caves, and it seems these creatures come from deep within them. And I can tell you from personal experience, it is best to leave sleeping dogs, or in this case bears, to lie. With the bears gone due to human activities, the crawlers have grown bold, emerging from their subterranean lairs to explore the surface world. But a question did still remain. What were the crawlers themselves? The days following our return were a haze of sleepless nights and frantic research. Some colleagues that were less open to the idea of these creatures without any solid evidence thought I was losing my mind. But I knew what I had seen, and evidence of their increases across the Appalachian Mountains was mounting. Sightings of the crawlers grew more frequent, accompanied by reports of missing pets, livestock, and even people. I delved into local folklore, hoping to find some historical context for these creatures. My research led me to a town called Ashwood. The old-timers there spoke in hushed tones of the Hollow Ones, an ancient evil said to dwell in the deepest parts of the earth. They recounted chilling tales passed down through the generations, stories of miners who vanished without a trace, and hunters who would return from the woods, raving mad and covered in wounds that no animal that they know of could have inflicted. The more I learned, the more I realized how dire our situation was. Via their circannual rhythms, their natural instincts, the bears had been inadvertent guardians, their presence a massive deterrent to the crawlers' incursion into human territory. Without them, there was nothing to stop these creatures from spreading, from claiming the night as their own throughout the mountains. I needed to understand how we allowed this balance to tip so drastically and, more importantly, how we could restore it. One evening, as I pored over my notes in the dim light of my cabin, there was a knock at the door. Constantly on edge these days, I inched towards it. Opening it, I saw Jane Harris, a local hunter and one of the few people that I consorted with who believed my story. She looked pale, her eyes wide with fear.
"Dr. Carter," she began, her voice trembling, "I found something. You need to see it."
We drove in silence to the edge of town, to a farm. Flashlights in hand, Jane led me out into the fields, where we were surrounded by cows that kept a wary distance. Much of the ground was churned up, and the air was heavy with the stench of decay. We arrived, and there, in a shallow grave, lay the remains of a man. His body was mutilated, the flesh torn and gnawed. He was barely recognizable as a man, but what caught my attention was the claw marks, long, deep gashes that no predator around here could have made.
"It's them, isn't it?"
Jane whispered. I took samples, hoping to find some clue that could help us understand the crawler's biology, their ancestry. As I worked, theories rose in my mind. The only explanation I could think of, I didn't want to say out loud. I didn't want to confirm it. But when the DNA came back, it was irrefutable. The first few samples returned as inconclusive. This is an unavoidable thing that sometimes happens, and can occur at any point in the process. But after several attempts and refining our techniques, the data began to form a coherent picture. The genetic sequences we extracted were unlike anything recorded in modern databases, yet there were unmistakable markers that pointed to a shocking conclusion. I remember the moment vividly. I was alone, the soft hum of the equipment the only sound as I stared at the screen. The sequences were familiar yet alien. There were similarities to the human genome, certain genetic markers that we shared, but there were also significant differences, mutations and adaptations that spoke of a long, isolated evolution. I had to get a second opinion from another scientific mind, so I invited Sarah around.
"These markers, they're hominid. The crawlers are a distant branch of our own family tree?"
It was a revelation that sent chills down my spine. The crawlers were not just ordinary monsters or cryptids. They were our cousins, an ancient offshoot of humanity that diverged countless millennia ago. Their adaptations to the subterranean world were extreme. Eyes sensitive to the faintest of light, limbs elongated for navigating tight spaces, and a metabolism slowed and suited to the sparse resources of their environment. We ran the tests again, cross-referencing with known hominid genomes, Neanderthals, Denisovans, and modern humans. The results were consistent. The crawlers shared an ancestor with us, but their evolution had taken them to the depths of the earth, where they had become something both familiar and horrifyingly different.
"They must have diverged hundreds of thousands of years ago,"
Sarah theorized, her mind racing with the implications.
"They must have retreated into the caves during some sort of ice age or other environmental pressure. Over time, they adapted to their new environment, becoming the creatures we see today."
I nodded, absorbing the magnitude of our discovery. This explains their resilience, their ability to thrive in the dark, but there's also a risk they're far more intelligent than we realized. They've shared ancestry with us, which could imply a capacity for social structures, even rudimentary culture. A few days later, our team all met in the lab, collating everything we had found so far, including some of the remains we found in the Whispering Caves. Their bones, while seemingly fragile, were incredibly strong, with a density that suggested a diet supplemented by minerals only found deep within the earth. The attachment for their muscles were compact and powerful, enabling sudden bursts of speed and strength. The discovery also shed light on their aggressive behavior. The crawlers, cut off from the surface world by other hominids and predators, had evolved in isolation, their survival instincts honed to a razor's edge. With the disappearance of the bears, their natural predators, had unbalanced this delicate ecosystem, allowing the crawlers to emerge and encroach upon human settlements, in a similar fashion to how the extirpation of wolves in Yellowstone and across the world increased the amount of mesocarnivores like coyotes and foxes. But this was all just speculation. Educated and informed speculation, but speculation nonetheless. We needed to study these creatures up close. We needed to take one alive. The task of capturing a crawler alive for the study was daunting, but we knew it was our best chance to understand these creatures and perhaps find a way to coexist with them. As after all, they were a branch of our own evolutionary tree. Could we classify them as people? We had to find out. Armed with tranquilizer guns and reinforced cages, our team, composed of Jane, Sarah, and I, along with a few other brave volunteers, ventured into the whispering caverns under the cover of night. Our target was a solitary crawler. We'd set up trail cameras days prior to confirm its presence, and it was there. It had a distinct pattern of movement, often returning to a secluded section of the cave where the echoes of its eerie cries suggested it was calling to others. This isolation made it the perfect specimen for our study. As we approached the chamber, I noticed the air grew colder, and the oppressive darkness seemed to pulse with a life of its own. We poised ourselves strategically, Jane and another hunter taking point with the tranquilizer guns, whilst the rest of us prepared a cage.
"There,"
Jane whispered, pointing towards a shadowy figure hunched near the far wall. The creature's pale skin glowed faintly in the dim light, its eyes reflecting an unearthly sheen. It was gnawing on something, possibly the remains of a raccoon. Its movement was slow, deliberate. "On my mark," I whispered back, my heart pounding in my chest. 1, 2, 3. Now! Jane and the other hunter fired simultaneously, the tranquilizer darts finding their mark. The crawler screeched, a high-pitched wail that echoed painfully through the cavern and ringing in our ears. It scrambled a bit, crawling at the darts embedded in its flesh, but within moments, the sedative took effect. Its movement slowed, and it collapsed to the ground with a convulsing heap. We rushed forward, secured the creature with reinforced restraints, and carefully lifted it into the cage. Despite the tranquilizers, it managed to thrash weakly, its eyes still aware and darting around with wild, feral intensity. The journey back to our makeshift lab was intense, every bump and jostle a reminder of the crawler's unnatural strength and power. Once inside the safety of the lab, we began our observations. The crawler was unlike anything we had encountered, a living relic. Its physical characteristics were a grotesque blend of human and feral beast, but it was the eyes that unsettled me the most. They had a glimmer of something human, something that hinted at a lost connection between us. We decided to attempt communication, hoping to bridge the gap between us. Sarah, who had a background in anthropology, took the lead.
"We're going to start with simple gestures,"
she said, her voice steady but laced with uncertainty.
"Let's see if it can mimic or respond in any way."
She approached the cage slowly, holding up her hand in a universal gesture for peace. The crawler watched her, its eyes narrowing, but remained still. She then placed a series of objects, a rock, a stick, and a piece of fruit, inside the cage, each representing basic concepts of tool use and sustenance.
"Watch carefully,"
Sarah instructed, demonstrating with exaggerated motions how each object could be used or consumed. The crawler's gaze flicked between her and the objects, its expression unreadable. For a moment, it seemed to comprehend. It picked up the stick, turning it over in its clawed hands, then glanced at the rock. We held our breath, waiting for a sign, a spark of recognition, a hint at human-like intelligence. But what came next dashed our hopes. The crawler snarled, its features contorting with primal fury, smashed the stick against the cage, splintering it into jagged shards, and hurled the rock against the bars, no doubt trying to hit Sarah. The fruit was torn apart, not eaten but destroyed in a fit of aggression. Sarah stepped back, her face pale.
It's not understanding. It's only reacting."
Jane, watching from a distance, shook her head.
"These things aren't like us. They're just animals."
Determined to give it another chance, I stepped forward. "Let me try something." I reached into my bag and pulled out a mirror, hoping that the crawler might recognize its own reflection, a simple self-awareness test. I held the mirror up to the bars. The crawler's eyes fixed on its own reflection, and for a brief moment, it seemed to pause, its aggression replaced by a flicker of curiosity. But then, just as quickly, it lashed out, shattering the mirror with a single swipe, barely missing my hand. Over a period of weeks that then turned to months, we captured other crawlers and attempted to try to understand these creatures better, to find a spark of human-like intelligence in any of them. But with each encounter, our hopes of conversation with something like us were dashed. Their world was one of darkness and violence, their behavior dictated by survival instincts honed over millennia of isolation. The crawlers, despite their distant relation to humanity, had evolved into something entirely different. Any semblance of intelligence they might have possessed was overshadowed by their inherent ferocity. Throughout this entire time, more and more people and animals went missing. Sightings continued to increase exponentially. So we made the decision as a team to publish our findings. But as we were in deep discussion about this, the sound of helicopters filled the air. Not long after, a convoy of black SUVs pulled up, and out stepped a group of men in suits, accompanied by armed guards. At their helm was a stern-faced man who introduced himself as Robert. "Doctors, we need to talk." We were escorted to a secure location, a government facility on the outskirts of Ashwood. There, in a sterile conference room, Agent Roberts laid out the situation. The government had been monitoring our progress and the rising incidents involving the crawlers. They were well aware of the creature's existence and the potential threat. "Your findings," Agent Roberts began, "are groundbreaking, but they're also classified. The public cannot know about the crawlers or their connection to humanity. It would cause too much panic and possibly the destabilization of many economies. Instead, we have a different solution." He went on to explain that the government had been planning a reintroduction of grizzlies and black bears into the Appalachian Mountains, using our research to ensure the success of the program. They recognized that the natural balance needed to be restored to keep the crawlers in check, which would also save them money in the long run. Although I did agree with their assessment, I could tell that their hearts were not in the right place. "Dr. Carter," Agent Roberts continued, "we're placing you in charge of this operation. You'll personally oversee the reintroduction of the bears, ensure their adaptation to the environment, and monitor the crawlers to confirm the balance is restored. With any hope, this will turn out just like the Wendigos and wolves in Montana." I had to do a double take after hearing that. I asked what he meant by that, but he refused to elaborate further. I tried to put up some semblance of protest, to ask for more time to think on this, but there was no point. The agent left the room, leaving only a dossier on the table. Over the following months, we worked tirelessly to prepare for the bears' reintroduction. We selected the healthiest individuals from various conservation programs, ensuring genetic diversity and robust health. Habitats were prepared, monitoring systems set up, and legislation was put in place to help protect them. The day finally came when the first group of grizzly bears were reintroduced to the northern forests of Appalachia. Watching them lumber into the wilderness, reclaiming their ancestral territory, was a moment of profound relief and hope for me. We tracked their progress meticulously, noting their interactions with the environment and any signs of crawler activity. As the bears settled into their new home, the impact was almost immediate. Crawler sightings near human settlements began to decrease, and the eerie reports from Ashwood residents dwindled. The bears, with their natural hunting instincts and territorial behaviors, pushed the crawlers back into the deeper caves, restoring the ancient balance. We continued to work in secrecy, refining our methods and ensuring the stability of the ecosystem. The government kept a close watch, but allowed us the autonomy to do what needed to be done. In the end, the solution was not one of eradication, but of restoring a keystone species. And although I feel a pang of biased sadness at reintroducing a predator to what is essentially our cousins, I knew it needed to be done. And now, years later, as I stand at the edge of the whispering caverns, the forest surrounding it teemed with life, I felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The scat of bears were prevalent on the edge of the cave, crawlers kept away, and the secret of their existence buried underneath the ground where it belonged, as the government believed at least. Now I retire my position. I know that one day this species will come to light. It may shake the very foundation of what people believe in, but secrets can only stay buried for so long.